Trump administration prepares to deport about 80 Ukrainians and why US has exhausted potential to tighten sanctions against Russia. We'll talk about this with David Tafuri, international lawyer and former US State Department official. Mr. Tafuri, it's a pleasure to welcome you and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me again.
David, overnight on November 14th, Russia launched another massive terror attack on Ukraine, deploying more than 400 drones, ballistic and air ballistic missiles. Targets included the capital, Kyiv region, Odessa region, and other areas. Should the US consider imposing new sanctions or expanding existing ones on Russia in response to these attacks? How can the US coordinate with NATO and EU allies to strengthen Ukrainians' air defense capabilities?
Yes, the U.S. should tailor the sanctions to Russian attacks on Ukraine. So far, while we have put sanctions, including new ones in the last few weeks, that hasn't curtailed Russia's attempts to kill civilians and to terrorize Ukraine. And in terms of what the U.S. should do to help with defense of Ukraine, we should provide more Patriot missiles, more air defense, and support Ukraine in getting longer range weapons so it can strike further behind front lines and hit the weapons depots and the supply lines of Russia to make it harder for them to continue to manufacture the weapons that they are using to illegally attack Ukraine. And at some point, enough is enough. And it's horrifying to keep seeing civilians who are non-combatants in Ukraine being killed by Russia.
US Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that Washington has effectively reached the limit of new sanctions it can impose on Russia. Rubio made the remarks to journalists following the G7 foreign ministers meeting in Canada. He noted that key Russian energy companies are already under restrictions and further measures will focus on stricter enforcement of existing sanctions regimes. What additional strategies can the US employ to pressure Russia now that the scope for new sanctions is limited? And how effective have the current sanctions been in influencing Russia's behavior, particularly regarding its actions in Ukraine?
First of all, Secretary of State Rubio is correct that we should do more implementation and enforcement of sanctions. That's a very important part. If you just put sanctions out there and you don't enforce them, they aren't effective. But I respectfully disagree with the Secretary of State that there's no more sanctions that can be done. The U.S. certainly has not run out of sanctions or economic retaliation against Russia. For instance, we could designate Russia as a foreign terrorist state. We've done that to other countries. We actually normally have about 3 countries. I believe Syria is no longer designated as a terrorist state, and Russia could be designated as a terrorist state. The purpose is to influence the conduct of a country. In the case of Syria, we have a complete change in government, and because the conduct changed, that's why that was removed. In this case, Russia's actions in Ukraine warrant designating it as a terrorist state. Also, we could do more secondary sanctions on the companies that buy Russian oil, that make it possible for Russia to generate revenues from oil. Many of these companies are from Russia and from China and from India, but also other countries as well, like Turkey, for instance, which is where I am right now. And it would be important that we do that because the companies are in this for profit-making purposes. And if you put secondary sanctions in place and you make it harder for them to do business in US dollars, make it harder for them to do business with American or Western companies, then they aren't going to seek a profit from Russia because it's not possible to make a profit when you face those types of consequences. So that's a really important thing that we could do. We could also do new sanctions on the banking sector in Russia. There are a lot of sanctions that the U.S. has considered but has not yet put in place. And Secretary Rubio and Secretary Bessent of Treasury could put in place new sanctions on the financial institutions in Russia, and that would also choke the Russian economy.
Could Washington consider non-sanction tools?
Yes, we should consider everything in the toolbox. I mean, the primary two ways to help Ukraine are sanctions against Russia and sanctions against those countries that assist and support Russia, and providing weapons, defense, training, and funding to enable Ukraine to defend itself. But there are lots of other things we can do, other ways we can put pressure on Russia. We can get our allies or countries that are non-aligned and put pressure on them to put pressure on Russia. And that's very important. We need to isolate Russia, including isolating it from its closest friends like China, as much as we can do.
American private investment firm Carlyle is exploring the potential acquisition of overseas assets of the Russian oil company Lukoil. Reuters, citing three sources familiar with the matter, reported that Carlyle is in the early stages of evaluating the acquisition. The company plans to apply for a U.S. license that would allow it to acquire the assets before conducting comprehensive due diligence, while noting that it may still choose to abandon the deal. What are the strategic motivations behind Carlyle's interest in acquiring Lukoil's overseas assets? What risks or challenges could arise from acquiring Russian energy assets amid ongoing sanctions and geopolitical tensions?
My understanding is that the OFAC office of U.S. Treasury is going to steward or manage the assets of Lukoil, which is now a sanctioned Russian state company that engages in gas and oil sales and oil exploration and gas exploration. So the foreign assets are now in jeopardy, which is a good thing because of the sanctions. And so if a company that is American or European wants to take over those assets, they're going to have to do so in compliance with U.S. law and U.S. sanctions, and they're going to have to ensure, I believe, that in taking over those assets, they aren't benefiting the Kremlin or anyone who is sanctioned in Russia, because the whole purpose of the sanctions is to punish Russia. You don't want to make it possible for the financial benefits that come from purchasing those assets are passed along to Russian state entities or to Putin himself.
David, Russia continues preparations for the summit in Budapest, Hungary, which has President Donald Trump allegedly either postponed or cancelled. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told Italian newspaper that Trump reportedly received backroom reports that led him to decline a meeting with the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. Lavrov claimed he does not know where and from whom these reports originated, while dismissing claims of Russia's unwillingness to negotiate as fake news. What do you think about this, and how might this situation influence future negotiations or war resolution efforts regarding Ukraine and other geopolitical issues?
Well, I think President Trump made the right decision in not going forward with that meeting with Putin in Hungary. It's not clear from the media reports what briefing he got or what information he received that caused him to cancel the meeting. But more generally, we know that Russia and Putin have made no concessions at all that would lead anyone to think that Russia is ready to engage in negotiations in good faith for a ceasefire in Ukraine. And I would say that there's no reason for President Trump to meet with Putin again until Putin makes specific concessions with respect to a possible ceasefire. And for now, none of his demands for what he would want to have a ceasefire have changed, really, since the invasion in February 2022. So he's the recalcitrant party here, and the United States should not reward Putin even with a meeting until it's clear he's actually making compromises.
David, about Trump's decision, the Trump administration is preparing to deport numerous Ukrainians with the final removal orders back to their war-torn homeland, reported the Washington Post. On Wednesday, the U.S. Department of Justice stated in a court filing that the government plans to deport Roman Surovtsev to Ukraine on Monday. What is the rationale behind the Trump administration's decision to deport Ukrainians with final removal orders amid the ongoing war? And here is your thoughts.
Well, this is an unfortunate development, and I hope the administration will consider how to make it possible for Ukrainians, many of whom were welcomed here when the invasion first happened, to remain in the United States. Many of them have work permits. They are contributing to the economy, and they're a really important part of communities around the United States. And I believe communities around America welcomed Ukrainians when they came and bent over backwards to make it possible for Ukrainians to live here. There was a lot of generous support from nonprofit organizations and from churches and religious organizations to support Ukrainians. And so I don't think deporting these Ukrainians is actually in line with what the American people believe and want. And so I hope for that reason, the Trump administration will reconsider. It is absolutely clear that parts of Ukraine remain unsafe for civilians, and many of them would have a well-founded fear of being returned back to their country, a well-founded fear of harm, or serious harm, or death if returned back to Ukraine. And that's the standard for refugees under international law. And that's why they've been welcomed in many countries around the world that support refugee laws. And so I hope the U.S. will also be cognizant of that as well.
David, the Trump administration has drafted new U.S. visa rules for foreigners. Under the new regulations, applicants with cancer, obesity, or various chronic illnesses could be denied entry. The Washington Post reports that immigration lawyers have criticized the decision as a dangerous expansion of consular authority, allowing denial of visas for common health conditions that were never previously considered disqualifying. What is the official rationale behind the Trump administration's new visa rules targeting applicants with certain health conditions? What do you think?
I think the Trump administration should explain the basis for this new requirement. And they haven't so far done a good job of explaining why it's in America's interest to put these new restrictions on people for receiving visas. And it's possible that there's a good reason, but I just don't know what that reason is. And I do agree that when you start putting restrictions like this, it's a slippery slope, and what restrictions will come next. America has been a country that is a destination for tourism. People from around the world want to see America. That contributes to our economy. And so I don't really understand why we would put these types of restrictions on people. And I hope there is a good reasoning. And if there's not, that we won't go forward with them.
David, and President Donald Trump signed a bill for temporary federal government funding, officially ending the longest government shutdown in U.S. history. CNN reports the bill reached the White House shortly after passage by the House of Representatives, and the president's signature finalized the resumption of government operations. How will the temporary funding bill, in your opinion, address the immediate operational and financial challenges caused by the longest U.S. government shutdown?
Well, it's going to take a little while for Washington to return to normal and for government function to get back to the level it was at before the government shutdown. But this is a good thing for America that there was ultimately a compromise reached in Congress. But I also think this is a warning sign that they haven't resolved the underlying issues that caused the government shutdown. And so we could face another government shutdown again in the coming year.
David, what steps are being taken to prevent similar prolonged shutdowns in the future?
Well, in my opinion, none are being taken. I mean, ultimately, Republicans and Democrats were able to reach a short-term agreement to reopen the government, but they actually haven't compromised on the underlying basis for disagreement, and Congress remains very polarized. And we need more people in Congress who are willing to reach across the aisle and do what's best for America rather than what's best for party.
Trump had previously expressed reservations about military action aimed at removing Nicolas Maduro, fearing such operations might fail. This week, President Trump was briefed on potential military options in Venezuela as he continues to consider the U.S.'s next steps in the country. What military options are currently being considered by the U.S. regarding Venezuela, and what are their potential risks and benefits?
I've been saying for a few months now that it looks like we're ratcheting up toward a military conflict with Venezuela. That's not inevitable, but that seems to be the way it's headed. If we are going to end up in a military conflict, I think it's very important that President Trump and the Trump administration make very clear communications to Venezuela what it can do to avoid a military conflict. And if we do go forward, that we have a very detailed, well thought out plan, both for the military action and for what comes after in Venezuela. We've made mistakes before in how we've done invasions and nation building, and so we have some bad past experiences. That doesn't mean we can't do it right, but it has to be on legitimate grounds. There has to be international law followed by the U.S. when we do something like this, and we have to make sure that there's going to be support around the world for rebuilding Venezuela if a conflict happens. Again, I don't think a conflict is going to happen, but we seem to be headed that way, so it's possible.
David, and also about the corruption scandal. The corruption scandal in Ukrainian's energy sector is extremely unfortunate, and it is important that Kiev takes it seriously, according to the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Kaja Kallas. She said they are acting very forcefully. There is no room for corruption, especially now. I mean, it is literally the people's money that should go to the front lines, Kallas said on the sidelines of a meeting of the G7 foreign ministers in Canada. According to her, it is crucial that the Ukrainian authorities intensify their fight against corruption and take this issue very seriously. So what do you think about this corruption scandal? Your emotion, your opinion, and what's next?
Well, it's shameful for anyone to engage in corrupt behavior to enrich themselves when money is so desperately needed to support the war effort and the defense of Ukraine. And I believe most Ukrainians feel that way. And Ukrainians deserve to have a government that's completely transparent and that has proper anti-corruption controls in place. And the donors and supporters of Ukraine, like the EU and the United States, also deserve that as well. So for Ukraine's future, it's going to be a democracy. It's going to be a country that follows the law, that observes rule of law. In order to do that, it's really important to have transparency in government processes and to have accountability. And so I think it's of paramount importance for Ukraine to punish those involved and to put in place the measures necessary to prevent this from happening again.
Thank you for this important and interesting conversation. Thanks for supporting Ukraine and Ukrainian people. David Tafuri, international lawyer and former U.S. State Department official, was with us today. Thank you for watching. Please share this interview and continue supporting Ukraine. Like and subscribe. See you.
Thank you. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.